Good morning. My name's Shawn Coyle. I work at Kentucky State University with Dr. Tidwell, who's already spoke this morning. And I'm going to talk to you about the production of feed-trained largemouth bass fingerlings, or really largemouth bass, the production of largemouth bass fingerlings through the first year. There's 4 different phases of production of largemouth during the first year. That's spawning, which happens in the spring. They're spring spawners, spawn once a year. The nursery period, where we feed them live feed, they don't perform well on artificial diets like catfish or rainbow trout. Initially, it's swim up fry, so we have to have a live feed phase, followed by feed training. We bring them indoors and crowd them in tanks and convince them to consume our artificial feed. And then when we stock them back out in the pond and we grow them, 150 grams here I have on the slide, that's for food fish production. It really depends on the management objective, but usually growing them between 4 inches to 10 inches during that first summer grow out. First, it starts with brood bass care. It takes about 3 pounds of forage or 20 pounds of forage to sustain a 3-pound brood stock largemouth for 1 year. Now, they can be raised on artificial feed or fed artificial feed, but it seems like that they perform better and spawn better with some forage, even just through the winter time. So you can use pellet trained fish, but add some forage through the winters to make sure that they spawn well in the spring. Goldfish, minnows, carp, bluegill, or tilapia are suitable forage, where tilapia are legal to have loose in ponds. Reproduction, generally the spawning temperature for largemouth is 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The fecundity is about 5,000 eggs per pound of female body weight. Now we can influence the spawning time through temperature and photoperiod manipulation. As I said before, they spawn once in the spring, but they need that winter time period. And then as the water warms that following winter and warms up to 64 degrees, they'll spawn. So you can bring them indoors and warm them up earlier and manipulate them to spawn earlier. Largemouth are fractional spawners or multiple spawners. So the female will only release a portion of her eggs at one time, and she'll spawn 2 or 3 times throughout the spawning period. So hormone injections usually don't work well or not practical. Also, the males don't emit freely milt. So artificial spawning with the males requires that you kill the male and masticated the testes in order to be able to use them for spawning. Largemouth have a relatively wide distribution throughout the US and into Canada and in Mexico. And because of the spawning is dictated by water temperature, this translates into much different or large difference in spawning time as you go north to south in the US. What this means to fish farmers is if I'm a fish farmer in Tennessee or really Ohio or Kentucky, it makes sense for me to buy fingerlings that are feed trained from Arkansas or further south so that I have a longer growing season in that first year. As you can see, if the fish doesn't spawn until May 1st, and then it takes about 2 months in order from spawning to obtain a 2-inch feed trained fingerling, then I've missed most of my summer growing season unless I buy my fingerlings from further south. Largemouth are generally paired in ponds when the temperatures have stabilized to 64 degrees. So they're maintained separately in ponds so that they don't spawn until that water temperature is stabilized. And the reason for this is if the water temperature drops into the 50s, the eggs will typically fungus up and you'll lose that year class of fish, or you'll lose that spawn. So it's important to keep them separate, or at least to not pull eggs or pull mats from ponds until the water temperatures are relatively stable. You can obtain eggs from 2-year-old fish. Typically 3-year-olds are used because they're just larger and they'll contain more eggs. So managing the spawning pond, largemouth are substrate spawners, so that they either spawn on gravel in a natural environment. They're going to fan the mud on the bottom of your pond or in the lake, and they're going to try to find some kind of a gravel bed to spawn on. Fish farmers either use spawning mats, which are filled with, or boxes, which are filled with gravel, Or typically nowadays, most folks are using Spawn Tech spawning mats, which is a coconut fiber mat that you just cut into 2-foot squares, and that seems the eggs are adhesive, so they stick to this mat very well. It allows you to transfer the mat indoors for incubation, or just to move the mat to another pond, a nursery pond. Depending on the objective, dictates the number of broodstock pairs that you would stock per pond. Some people will just leave the broodstock in the pond with the fry, and then seine the broodstock. Once the fry become about 1 inch, they'll remove them from the pond before they would cannibalize them. And they would stock only 5 or 10 pair per acre. Another method is when you transfer the mats from the spawning pond to a fertilized nursery pond, or bring them indoors to incubate them in tanks, then you can stock up to 100 pair per acre. Largemouth are territorial, and it's important to keep the substrate spaced about 10 feet apart in the pond. Some people will stock only 1 male per female, and that works fine. But you have to realize that when a male has, it depends on how often you're going to check your spawning mats. Once a male has a contribution from 1 female, which may only be a portion of her eggs, or will be a portion of her eggs, he's kind of out of the spawning game, and he's just protecting that mat. So it can be important to have more males than females to ensure that there's a spawning mat for all the females. Tank spawning really was developed in Florida and Texas at the relatively large bass factories that are producing 5 or 10 million fingerlings per year. And this allowed them to more easily control the incubation temperature of the eggs, again, because of the problem with fungus on the eggs if they're incubated below really 68 or 70 degrees. So this is something that we looked at years ago, was tank spawning, and seeing if we could influence them to spawn earlier simply by covering the tanks with either a greenhouse cover or an insulated blanket. We were able to do that, but the problem there is that you produce a spawn earlier and the ponds aren't ready with zooplankton. So the spawning time really is dictated by the spawning temperature, which is just corresponds to the availability of the appropriate size zooplankton in fertilized ponds. So getting them to spawn earlier really didn't help us in this situation. Fry development is dependent on temperature, but at 68 degrees, it takes 3 or 4 days for the eggs to hatch, and then another 3 or 4 days for the fry to swim up. Normally 75% of the eggs hatch, and 60% of the fry survive the swim up stage. Again, it's important for that incubation temperature to be 68 or 70 degrees to stay ahead of the fungus that will develop on the mat if you're going to incubate the eggs on the mats. Again, it's generally accepted that first feeding fry won't accept artificial feeds, and that's somewhat true, but really what we think is that it's the digestive enzymes that the small fry lack, so they're not able to digest artificial feeds initially. So they obtain these digestive enzymes from the zooplankton that they would naturally consume in the pond. So generally, we're still using pond fertilization in a nursery phase, although methods have been developed to intensively rear fry indoors on artificial feeds, and we'll talk about that later. But it's important to have fertilized nursery ponds with a good supply of zooplankton. And as a cannibalistic piscivorous fish, of course, when food becomes scarce, the losses from cannibalism can be substantial. Some of the earlier work that we did at Kentucky State University was to, and this goes along with the tank spawning and the incubation of the undercover, so that we could produce our fingerlings earlier. So we have been buying them from Arkansas, we still are. But our intention was to try to develop a technique where we would be able to produce 2-inch feed train fingerlings the 1st of June in Kentucky, where the fish don't spawn until the 1st of May. We needed to be able to spawn them earlier and then rear them for at least a month on artificial feeds and try to feed train them at a smaller size. So initially we determined that they would eat Artemia as first feeding fry, and they did quite well on Artemia for about 2 weeks. And then we subsequently habituated them to artificial feed following the 2-week Artemia feeding phase. It's just a picture of the experimental system. And this shows you the different diets that we used. We used Otohime, performed well. This is a Japanese marine fish starter feed. We used decapsulated Artemia, which worked well, and a product of Arctic copepod cyclopedes seemed to work okay as transitional diets to transition them to trout starter. And this transitional period was about 1 week, and then we would put them on trout starter for 2 weeks and ultimately have them on feed, which again was a 5-week process. So it's similar in time frame from the first nursery pond period, but you already have a feed trained fingerling at the end of this 5 weeks. So we developed this process of feeding live Artemia for 2 weeks. Decapsulated Artemia cyst was the best performing of the transitional diet. And we evaluated this with both a wild and a domestic source. The domestic is our typical northern strain food fish, and the wild was from a body of water in Kentucky that had never received supplemental stocking. So these were true Kentucky fingerlings. Now this shows you the survival after this process. This is fully habituated to 1.5 millimeter floating dry feed, which would be considered now a sellable 2-inch feed trained fingerling. And you can see that the domestic strain performed better than the wild, but really this shows you that 60% survival is possible all the way through. This basically was about an 8-week process to get them to 2-inch, which again is similar to the period of time that it would take if we went into a fertilized nursery pond and then brought them in and feed trained them. So it's about similar. Okay, so if we're not doing the intensive rearing and we're going to do it the traditional way, you're going to transfer your fry, either fry that were spawned indoors or fry that were collected from a spawning pond, or either going to transfer your mats, but they're going to go into a fertilized nursery pond. It's important to fertilize the pond approximately 2 weeks before stocking so that you can obtain suitable zooplankton populations. Stocking at about 50,000 to 100,000 fry per acre typical yields about 50,000 1 to 2 inch fingerlings that then you would subsequently bring indoors for feed training. It's important to harvest them really before they reach 2 inches. At 2 inches, they're shifting from a diet of zooplankton to they're becoming more piscivorous, so they're looking for larger food sources. They probably at about 1.5 inches, they'll really be eating larger benthic macroinvertebrates, bloodworms, and such. So at 2 inches, really zooplankton isn't their preferred diet, and they're going to start eating each other. Next couple of slides just show collecting swim-up fry from a spawning pond and transferring these fry to a fertilized nursery pond. So you just identify the schools. Sometimes you use a white bucket lid fastened to a stick with cable ties or something so that you can see the schools, and then you just target those schools and seine them. So these fish are probably about 10 days old. In order to enumerate them, because it's very difficult to count that many fry, what we typically do is use these white wash tubs, and we would actually physically count 1,000. And then you'd have some idea what 1,000 swim-up fry look like in this white saucer. And then we would just estimate from there and transfer into the fertilized nursery ponds, again, at a density of around 50,000 per acre. So there's different approaches to the nursery pond. Again, some use a 2-step process. That's the most typical, is to either spawn the fish indoors in tanks and raceways, or to spawn them in a spawning pond and then transfer them to a nursery pond. Others do smaller scale operators that don't have as many ponds would sometimes remove the broodstock and rear them in the same pond to 1 to 2 inches. There's many different approaches to fertilizing nursery ponds. Some people just realize from year after year that their ponds have enough nutrients in them and produce good zooplankton populations without adding any fertilizer. And this is all pond dependent, very site specific. Some folks use food fish ponds that have received a lot of nutrients the year before, so they wouldn't require fertilization. But typically fertilization is necessary. Approximately 200 pounds of an organic fertilizer is added in 1 week, and then we start a week later, you would start adding 10 to 15 pounds per acre per day of some organic fertilizer. Typically alfalfa pellets or rice bran, soybean meal is used for this purpose. You'll notice that the water will start out green, which is a phytoplankton dominant color, and then it'll take on more of a brown color, which I consider to be a good zooplankton color. You need to sample the zooplankton populations at least weekly, if not 3 times a week, and you should see that have at least 100 organisms per liter of suitable size zooplankton for the bass. It may be necessary to chemically treat the nursery ponds for filamentous algae. Seems to be the biggest problem when harvesting the small fry. They don't tolerate that kind of handling. Getting tangled up in the filamentous algae it can be real problematic during the harvest. So that's important. Copper sulfate can be used generally for this purpose in the spring. It's also important to check the oxygen levels, and even on the bottom of the pond, as the organic fertilizer, as it breaks down and decomposes, it can cause a depletion in oxygen. So next would be harvesting the fingerlings. And again, this is 45 to 60 days after we've stocked the swim up fry. They should be 1 to 2 inches. It's real important to be gentle on them and use soft mesh nets. And again, to try to manage that pond to be free of filamentous algae. Feed training. So the next phase is feed training. So at 1 to 2 inches, largemouth become more piscivorous. It's just a transitional period where they're looking for a larger food source. And it's during this transition that they can be most easily trained to eat artificial diets. This is accomplished by stocking them at relatively high density in tanks to take advantage of the competitive nature or behavior of largemouth and feed them often highly palatable feeds. So stocking density is really dependent on flow rate and the quality of the water. The higher the density, the better the competitive, usually the better the success. But they're often stocked at between 10 and 80 fish per gallon, but this is dependent upon the flow rate and the quality of the water. You know, if you have pond water or spring water and that's been treated, it works much better. And as long as you have the flow rates, then you would want to stock them at the higher end of that density. They're fed 2 to 8 times a day. And again, this is really dependent on your management, the intensity. So the more often you feed them, the more often you have to clean the tank. So if you're a one-man show, feeding them 2 times a day seems to work fine, and you won't have to be up all night siphoning raceways. The training diet is used to simulate feeding, and then you slowly transition them to the grower pellet. This seems to have been more important. It depends on the strain of the fish that you're using. I know with the Florida strain, they'll bring them in and feed them Artemia initially, and it's real important that they have some sort of a training diet, or they use otoheme or some very expensive feeds to transition them. But through the domestication process, now the northern food fish strains that we obtain, feed training has become much easier over the last 25 or 30 years, just really through domestication. Training tanks, often raceways are used. Relatively shallow tanks seem to work well. You know, the deeper the tank, the more it's much more difficult to clean a deeper tank, and it seems like you get the feed in front of them more easily where there's shallow tanks. Flow rate and exchanges of 2 to 8 exchanges per hour are recommended, but again, this is dependent upon the water that you have available. This is something that I've always felt that when we bring fingerlings in that are feed trained fingerlings, if they use automatic feeders during that feed training process, the fish really aren't habituated to people. And I think feeding by hand, at least for a period of time before they go out into the ponds, is important so that the fish kind of identifies humans as their food source. Much of the early research that you'll find in the 90s, even the early 2000s, was based on the use of freeze-dried krill as a feed training diet. But in 2015, FDA removed krill and krill meal from the use as an animal feed in the U.S. So that kind of caused a little bit of a scramble for folks to look for a different feed training diets. Otohime came on the market at around that time, and it contained krill meal as the #1 ingredient. And this is a marine larval diet, but you can get it from the smallest fry sizes all the way up to 1.5 millimeter floating pellets, and it works real well during the feed training of largemouth. So your final diet is going to be a diet that's similar in formulation or the same formulation as your grow out feed, unless the ultimate goal is to get them on a 1.5 millimeter or 2.5 millimeter floating feed. Floating feeds are preferable because they stay in the strike zone longer. They're certainly advantageous for when you're feeding in ponds because you can see the fish eat and you know that they're eating. But during the feed training period, I think it's real important to use a floating diet because it just stays under the top of the water and you get them to come to the surface. You can see them eat. Gradual transition from a feed training diet to the prepared feed is something that was developed, and it works really well, where you would feed them just the training diet for a few days, followed by a slow transition to the ultimate goal is to get them on the grower feed. So it's a slow transition to the practical diet. And that can take 2 weeks, generally 10 days to 2 weeks. I'm going to show you a few different, some of the research that we did as a way to eliminate the need for krill in a training diet. First thing we looked at was using ground fish. These are just ground up fathead minnows where we top coated the feed, and it actually worked better than the krill. Shows you the effective initial size. So on the right-hand side, those are 2-inch fish. So it's basically a 1-inch fish and a 2-inch fish. You can see that this wasn't statistically significant, but the 2-inch fish did perform somewhat better. Shows the effective water temperature, which is, as you would think, that the warmer the temperature is going to cause the fish to feed train more readily. And that was the case. 86 degrees worked better than 77 degrees even. In this study, we looked at just top coating the final diet or the practical feed with either water, which is the moist, fish oil, or nothing. And just wetting the feed seemed to work just as well as the krill. Fish health is always important, but it's certainly important during the feed training period where you have the fish really crowded in tanks. And it's important to minimize all stress because bacterial infections and parasites coming out of the winter time are often a problem. And also some conditions that can be stressful are bright light. So it's important to keep the lux down below 250, make sure that your oxygen levels are high, and your ammonia is low. Tank cleaning. It's important to clean the nutrient rich water and a bunch of uneaten feed is going to result in the columnaris disease during the feed training period. So it's important that the tanks be cleaned at least once a day. And it can be necessary to drain half the water out of the tanks in order to clean them well. Fish are typically crowded to one end with a divider and then cleaned by siphon. Just some of the disease treatments that I've used typically during the feed training period. It's necessary to salt. I salt them every day at 3 to 5 grams per liter, and then just allow it to flush out. Potassium permanganate, only really if we have a columnaris problem, I would use that at 2 parts per million above the organic demand. Copper sulfate, usually clean them up with copper as soon as they come in to make sure that they don't have any gilt parasites at 1 part per million at an alkalinity of 100 milligrams per liter, which is what we run here in Kentucky. And medicated feed, of course, if necessary, but through a VFD. This is some of the earlier work that we did. Again, columnaris being a problem during feed training. And we looked at the possibility. At that time, terramycin was available, and a lot of people used terramycin prophylactically. A lot of the producers did, and we wanted to see if that was warranted and if it worked. And this just shows the mortality during feed training, which is relatively low and not different with the treatments. But we've got a terramycin bath treatment, a terramycin fed treatment where we fed them prophylactically through the 14-day feed training period, and then a vaccine, which was specific to columnaris, and then the control. This shows you the results after a 20-day challenge, where we challenged them with live cultures of Aeromonas. And you can see that the OTC bath worked real well, and so did the terramycin fed, similar to the vaccine. Maintaining a uniform size is important always with largemouth bass because they are cannibalistic. But during the feed training period, it becomes more pronounced because the earlier fish that'll feed train within the first couple of days, after 10 days, they're considerably larger than those that haven't taken to the feed yet. So it's real important to grade them at least once a week to remove the feeders from the non-feeders during this time. Reconfirming feed training. This is a little bit controversial, I think, but some producers add an additional step to ensure that the feed trained fingerlings that they've purchased are on feed before they put them out into ponds. And the problem is that a 2-inch fish, once you stock them out at first year densities of, let's say, 10,000 per acre, oftentimes it takes them a while to come to the food. Now there's natural food in that body of water, and they may forget about feed training, and they don't, and maybe a portion of them won't retain that learned feed training behavior. So what some producers do is they either use a block net in the pond to crowd them in a smaller space, or they put them in tanks at relatively high density for a couple of weeks in order to get them to a larger size of about 3 inches, which really confirms the feed training before they put them out into ponds. A problem with this is that it's during the summertime, so you've got to handle them again. You're bringing them into your facility right after feed training. The water temperatures may be 75 degrees at this time, but in 2 weeks, the water temperatures could be over 80 degrees. So you've got to handle them again to stock them out into ponds. So seems to be important, I know, but I also know that it can be a problem handling the fish at that warm water temperature. So first year densities really are dependent on the objective. If you think about these are valuable fish, at the end of the first year, they're going to be worth, let's say, $2 a piece. So if I stock 10,000 fingerlings in a 1 acre pond, with the ultimate goal of getting them to a half pound, I've got 5,000 pounds of fish that are worth, if they're $2 a piece, that's worth $20,000. So this is a real crucial time to get them to that size. And it's important that during the first year that you get them to your target size. So if I'm a food fish producer, I think I want a fish that's at least 150 grams, about 8 inches, in order for them to make a minimum of 1.25 pounds following the second year growth. However, if I'm going to sell them for stocking sport fish ponds, it may be more advantageous for me to have them at 4 to 6 inches and still charge $2 a piece. And in that case, I can stock 20,000 per acre. So it really depends on the management objective. Within my opinion, it's important to have them about 150 grams for food fish fingerlings. They're fed floating diets during the first year to satiation, usually once per day. And the diets are typically over 45% protein and over 15% lipid. So again, they're fed high protein, high fat diets. This is partly due to their inability to digest or utilize carbohydrates efficiently, which seem to be cause some liver problems. Most people use floating diets, and float, in order to make the feed float, requires that we add about 20% carbohydrate. So most diets that are developed for largemouth contain exactly right at 20% of carbohydrate, the minimum amount that's necessary for the feeds to float. And this is just a management, makes it easier to feed the fish using floating feeds, but some people feed slow sink diets, which I've seen work very well. It's just hard to manage to feed them efficiently, particularly when you have heavy blooms and you can't see the fish well. As long as the waters are clear, then it's relatively easy to feed a slow sink or a sinking feed. They feed best during low light periods at dusk and dawn. And due to their competitive nature and aggressive behavior, where often the most aggressive fish can suppress the feeding activity of the less aggressive fish in a population or the smaller fish. I know some farmers think it's important to feed them really fast and spread the feed out down one levee of the pond in order to spread the feed out so that everybody has access to the feed, and it kind of takes away the ability of the bullies to influence the others' feeding activity. Okay, so this slide just shows first year growth in ponds. Now this is Kentucky data, so this is what you would expect a catfish and a largemouth and a walleye to do in the first year in Kentucky. And you can see that largemouth do quite considerably better than a cool water fish, and maybe not quite as good as a catfish during the summer grow out period in Kentucky. But you see we just missed the 150 grams. We were 130 grams in this study with largemouth. So what about recirculating systems? There's been a few different papers that have been published recently on largemouth production, first year and second year growth in recirculating aquaculture systems in tanks. And there are obviously the advantages is that you can maintain suitable water temperature year round in recirculating systems. But the disadvantages appears to be that they don't grow quite as fast in recirculating systems as they do in ponds during the period of time when they're actively eating and growing. Recirculating systems are stocked at approximately 100 times the stocking density of ponds in most cases. And this is, based on what we can get away with in recirculating systems. Usually it's a 1/4 pound to a 1/2 pound per gallon. I know the holy grail in recirculating systems with largemouth would be to get them up to 1 pound per gallon, but they just don't tend to do very well. They don't perform as well during the same period of time as they do in ponds, and that appears to be density dependent. What we see in recirculating systems is a lot more size variability, which appears to be the bullies suppressing the feeding activity of the smaller fish. And when you have them in much closer proximity, they have more ability to do that in tanks. Cage culture, I know that there's some reports that coming out of China that they're raising them in cages. relatively large cages, probably more like a net pen, but they have not done well in small cages. They seem to, largemouth are susceptible, real susceptible to columnaris and aeromonas, and they tend to bump themselves as they feed aggressively or escape each other chasing and tail chasing, and they end up getting bumped up against the cage and cause them to be sick. Health in largemouth, probably still this carbohydrate liver problem. We see some unexplained mortality in largemouth where the fish looks healthy and you'll take them to the lab and they'll say there's nothing wrong with them, but they're dying. They come to the surface, they're stargazing, and we lose some fish through unexplained mortality. And the only thing that we can see is a fatty liver. So that has been implicated in part of the problem. They are susceptible to bacteria and fungus infections. We do have some winter kill. So if you handle them in the summer, if they've got aeromonas in the summertime, often we'll lose some fish through the winter time, which appears to be what we'll call winter kill, but it's also often fungus or saprolegnia. Largemouth bass virus, something that's certainly been in the news, but we really haven't seen that to be a problem causing mortality on fish farms yet. During harvest, it's real important to be gentle on them, use soft mesh nets, don't overload the baskets. They do not tolerate handling in the summertime. It's best when the water temperatures are less than 60 degrees Fahrenheit. They tend to do okay even under ice, harvesting them under ice, so you really can't be too cold to move them, but they do not tolerate handling when the water temperatures are above 80 degrees. So again, the best range to minimize stress would be 40 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Salt's real important during transport, and net handling should be kept to a minimum. So following the first year grow out, again, it's important to size grade them whenever you have an opportunity, but it's real important to size grade them, particularly after that first year grow out and stock what most farmers do is they're going to take the larger fish, the 8 to 10s, and they're going to go to food fish ponds, and the smaller 4 to 6s are going to go to sport fish sales. So that helps to eliminate this size disparity. But if you don't size grade them, what often happens is that you're going to have poor survival during that second year because the smaller fish are going to be eaten. And that's it. Have any questions?
Thank you, Shawn. We do have one question.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit more about what it looks like to do a potassium permanganate above 2 parts per million above demand? So what do you mean by above demand?
Okay, so potassium permanganate is an oxidizer. So it's going to oxidize any organic material in the water before there's sufficient chemical to help oxidize the bacteria infection on the fish or parasite, whatever it may be that we're trying to attack on the fish. So what we normally do is you would do a serial dilution with a solution of potassium permanganate, and you would set up, let's say 5. I mean, it depends on the range that you're wanting to look at, but often you can tell if you've got either no organics or you've got heavy organic load. And let's say I have a moderate organic load, I really don't know. I would set up 5 different quart jars, and I would add the equivalent of 2 milligrams per liter, 4 milligrams per liter, 6, 8, and 10. And then you would wait 15 minutes. And when it's oxidized, it's going to go from that purple or light purple color or wine red color to brown. So you would then look across the different concentrations, and the 2 concentrations where it's either brown and then the next one's still purple, that brown one would be your organic demand. So you'd want to go then 2 milligrams per liter over that. So for example, if everything was brown, 2 and 4 were brown, and there was a slight purple color left at 6, I would say that my organic demand is somewhere between 4 and 6. So I would say let's treat at 6. And then what we would do is you would watch this for an hour, is what I typically do indoors in tanks. And if I can maintain that purple color for an hour at 6, that's great. But if it browns off before an hour, then I would add another 2 milligrams per liter of potassium permanganate to ensure that I could put the chemical on them long enough.
Thank you.
We are, and I'll let Amy tell me if we should keep going or not, but I'm going to ask one more question here from Jim. We heard a lot from Shawn, even though it was broken up in the beginning. We want to get a little bit of idea how feasible it would be to set up a little hatchery here in the Midwest. This is kind of what I already talked about, but he talks about how seemingly expensive it would be to set up a small hatchery and try to provide what we see as a bit of a need here. And we already talked about the market not really showing saturation at this point. So is it pretty feasible?
You want me to chime in?
Yeah, whoever wants to do it. Like, would it be feasible enough for someone who doesn't have millions and millions of dollars to set up a smaller facility, a handful of ponds, maybe a small pole barn, so that they can feed train their own fingerlings and maybe provide enough for it's either a part-time job, a full-time job, whatever it may be, but just supplying the fingerlings only?
I don't know. It seems to me that it's, everybody's buying their fish from Arkansas because they're the main supplier and they spawn earlier. We could do it ourselves, but they spawn later. So you're trying to produce a food fish in 2 years. We need them to get as big. I mean, my experience is if they're not 8 inches by the end of the first year, they're not going to make 1.5 pounds. And they need to be 1.5 pounds average weight for the minimum fish to be 1.25 pounds. They don't want many 1 pound fish. And I don't know what the difference in Southern Illinois. It's probably spring water. I mean, you got groundwater, so they're able to potentially, you've got a longer growing season. Just Southern Illinois may have a little bit longer growing season than we do. But anybody north of Kentucky, if you don't get an 8-inch fish, we're just not making size. So it seems to me that we would go further south if possible. I would look towards Mississippi or Florida. If you could stock a 4-inch fish the 1st of June, and that's possible out of Florida, that's what makes sense to me. Otherwise, if you go north up in the Midwest, it probably needs to be indoors, or you've got to look at a 3-year production scenario. And we know that once they're all sexually mature going into that third, they just don't grow very well in the 3rd year. They may put 1 pound of weight on the 2nd year, and then they're going to be back to putting only 1/4 pound in the 3rd year on dry feed. So that's kind of my take on it.
The other thing I'd say in that vein is Arkansas is not waiting, man. You got a couple of really big bass producers down there, and they're looking at going indoors all the way and skipping the nursery pond and bringing them back in and doing larval feeding like Jim was talking about and Shawn years ago, and actually doing that on a production scale. They got the funds and they've got some government money behind them, so they're not waiting. They're big and don't intend to let anybody catch up, so they're looking to go all the way through indoors on some of this production. And some of the big state hatcheries already do it to some extent.
That's a very good addition there, and that kind of hits on what they were asking about regarding going completely indoors for these. But we're starting to get into questions where we don't have Carol Engel here to talk more on the economics or any of these other. Well, KK, he's got his video off, but he's welcome to chime in on his thoughts there. But yeah, I can imagine it's ridiculously expensive to do such in order to provide enough of those fingerlings to make it worth it. But yeah, that's a good point. A lot of Arkansas is trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, and we did it. We worked with our biggest producer the paper Giovanni referred to, the Scuttle Wreck, was one of our master's students, and we saw him all the way through and got pretty excited and did it a little bit at scale, went down, worked with Robert Mayer, set him up, helped him do it at a fairly commercial scale. And it was just so labor intensive, even at his scale, that it was still cheaper to go buy a little 2-inch fish from Arkansas, background him a little bit and get him out in the pond. So it was one of those, the surgery was a success, but the patient died, so.
Hey.
One comment, we did put that book together year before last, and I guess this is not the shameless commerce division. We don't make anything on those books. We did it to compile the best information that was available at the time to be a resource to folks just like in this workshop. So that's the only reason we did it, and that resource is there, so try to utilize it.
Jim, can you share the title of that book again?
I was actually using it to put this presentation together. So Largemouth Bass Aquaculture.
So that'll be a great resource with all the information that was shared today, plus a lot more, well, with the exception of the research that's coming out of SIU. Well, thank you, everybody.